There is a region of space at the edge of the mapped galaxy where the rules of the conquered simply stopped applying. A region where a probe sent to chart empty void returned carrying footage of a world it had never been sent to. A region where the species that built the probe discovered, by accident, that they had been watched for longer than they had been a civilization. A region where the assumptions on which the conquered had built 4,000 years of peaceful expansion came apart in a single afternoon, in a single archive room, when a junior engineer noticed a reflection in a window that should not have existed. That region was the outer quiet, and the story of what happened there between galactic standard years 2189 and 2231 is one of the most extraordinary and least taught chapters in the history of the conquered of worlds. Most of you know the official version of First Contact in broad strokes: the conquered's gentle expansion, the careful protocols, the diplomatic ceremonies on the Great Hall of the Spire, the image of two species meeting across a polished table, each presenting their credentials, each speaking through translators, each behaving as the textbook said civilized species should behave. That image is fixed in the conquered's popular imagination as the way First Contact happened, the way First Contact has always happened, the way First Contact must happen for any species worth meeting. That image is real. It is also a lie of omission so vast that an entire generation of conquered historians has built careers on not looking at it directly. The other half of the story happened in the dark, in the silence, in the years before any ceremony took place. It happened in the borderlands of conquered space and in the quiet rooms of human listening stations, and in the long, patient years during which one species watched another species without ever once announcing itself. And the species doing the watching was a species the conquered had never met, had never imagined, and had never thought to look for. Understanding why the outer quiet became the place where the conquered's understanding of intelligence broke apart requires understanding what the conquered believed about intelligence in the first place. By 2189, the conquered had been a stable interstellar civilization for nearly 4 millennia. It included 63 species, governed 212 inhabited worlds, and operated a network of automated probes that mapped the boundaries of its territory with such patient thoroughness that the conquered's cartographers spoke of their work as a sacred trust. The conquered's understanding of how intelligence behaved was built on a single foundational assumption: any species advanced enough to detect a probe would announce itself. This was not a guess. It was a pattern observed across every one of the 63 member species. Every civilization the conquered had ever encountered had, upon reaching the threshold of detecting alien technology, broadcast its existence. Some had broadcast eagerly. Some had broadcast cautiously. Some had broadcast encoded scientific signals that took the conquered's linguists decades to parse. But every single one of them had broadcast. The conquered's protocols therefore assumed that silence meant absence. A region of space from which no signals emerged was a region without intelligent life. A probe that returned with no contact data had returned from emptiness. The outer quiet, a region beyond the formal boundary of conquered space that contained no broadcasting civilizations, was therefore a region the conquered considered safe to leave unpatrolled. The conquered was wrong about exactly one species. They watched first. The probe that began the unraveling was a standard Veil-class cartographic unit, designated Probe 742, sent into the outer quiet in 2188 to update the boundary maps. It was unarmed. It was unmanned. It was expected to return in approximately 14 conquered months with routine data on 3 uninhabited star systems. It returned in 11 months. That was the first anomaly. Nobody flagged it. Probes occasionally returned early. The retrieval team logged it, performed the standard data extraction, and filed the results in the cartographic archive. The second anomaly was discovered by accident, 6 weeks later, by a junior engineer performing a routine quality check on the visual data. Her name was Mara Tellin. Mara Tellin was not a captain. She was not a diplomat. She was not, by any measure the Concord recognized, an important person. She was a third-year technician in the probe maintenance division of the Vale Cartographic Service, assigned to one of the least prestigious jobs in the archive system. Her work involved running visual data through quality filters and flagging any frames with artifacts, distortions, or sensor errors that might require recalibration of future probes. She was good at her work. She was patient in the way that the best technicians are patient. She did not rush. She looked at every frame. And on the 17th day of her review of probe 742's data, she noticed something in a single frame that should not have been there. The frame in question was a standard orbital shot of one of the outer quiet star systems. The probe had passed within sensor range of a small planet, recorded several thousand frames of routine surface and atmospheric data, and moved on. The system contained no broadcasting civilizations, no detectable technology, and nothing of cartographic interest beyond the standard boundary update. What Mara Tellin saw in that single frame was a reflection. The probe had passed over a particular angle of the planet's surface at a particular moment, and in the visual data, in the curve of the probe's own external sensor housing, there was a reflection of something behind the probe. The reflection showed a vessel. It was small, it was unfamiliar, it was of no design the Vale Cartographic Service had ever seen, and it was following the probe. Mara Tellin looked at that reflection for a long time. She ran enhancement protocols. She cross-referenced the design against the Concord's vessel database. She found no match. She checked the probe's sensor logs to see if any contact had been registered. There had been none. The vessel was not detected by the probe's primary sensors. It had only appeared in the reflection because of an accident of geometry that the vessel's pilots could not have anticipated. She had two options. She could report what she had found through standard channels, which would mean an immediate escalation to the Concord's contact protocols, and a public investigation that would consume the next year of her professional life and might never produce a clear answer. Or she could be quiet about it, quiet in the way the thing in the reflection had been quiet. She could investigate first, understand what she had found, and only then decide what to do with it. She chose the second option. The decision Mara Tellin made on that afternoon, alone in a junior technician's review booth in the cartographic archive, set the tone for everything that followed. The Concord's understanding of how the era would unfold has often described her choice as a betrayal of protocol. The understanding I am offering here is different. The understanding I am offering is that Mara Tellin, in choosing to look before she spoke, was the first member of the Concord to understand what kind of species the Concord had just met. She did not yet know what humans were, but she had already, in her response to her first sight of them, begun to think the way they thought. The hidden network is the part of this story that the official Concord histories cannot fully account for, and the part that the Vale Cartographic Service spent 40 years trying to suppress. When Mara Tellin began her private investigation, she expected to find evidence of a single covert vessel. What she found instead, slowly, and through the kind of patient cross-referencing that her work had trained her for, was evidence of a network. Human observers had been present in the borderlands of Concord space for at least 11 years before Probe 742 returned with their reflection. They had not been hiding in the way a hostile species would hide. They had been present in plain sight, conducting themselves in ways that did not trip the Concord's detection protocols, because the Concord's detection protocols were calibrated for broadcasting civilizations, and humans did not broadcast. They traded. They listened. They learned the languages of the border worlds by sitting in spaceport taverns and not speaking. They paid in goods that Concord merchants accepted without asking too many questions. They moved through the edges of the Concord's economy in a way that left almost no documentary trace. Because the documents that would have recorded their presence were written by the same merchants who were profiting from their business, and those merchants had no incentive to write anything down. What Mara Tellon eventually understood, after 8 months of quiet investigation, was that respectable conquered merchants on at least 14 border worlds had been knowingly trading with humans for years, not by accident, not under duress. By choice, because the trade was profitable, and because the humans were easy to deal with, and because nobody in the Concord's regulatory apparatus had ever told them not to, because nobody in the Concord's regulatory apparatus knew that humans existed. Some of those merchants were Vale. Some of them were from families whose names appear in the official archives as founders of border world settlements, as pillars of the Concord's expansion, as the kind of respected commercial figures whose statues now stand in the public squares of the worlds they helped to build. They knew, they had known for years. The Concord's understanding of itself as a civilization that controlled its own borders, that knew its own membership, that decided which species it recognized and on what terms, was already a fiction by the time Mara Tellon began her investigation. Humans had not been kept out. They had been quietly let in by the very merchants whose job it was to keep the Concord's commerce orderly. And the merchants had let them in because the humans, unlike every other species the Concord had ever encountered, had not asked for any of the things that formal contact would have required them to ask for. They had simply traded. They had simply listened. They watched first. The 11 years of quiet human presence in Concord space had produced something that the Concord's official history still refused to describe accurately. It had produced a shadow economy, an unofficial diplomatic channel, and a generation of border world merchants who knew far more about humans than the Concord's intelligence services did. It had produced, in other words, a relationship the Concord had not negotiated, had not approved, and had not even noticed. When Mara Tellon finally brought her findings to her supervisor, 11 months after she had first seen the reflection, the response she received was not the response she had expected. Her supervisor, a senior Vale archivist whose name appears nowhere in the public records of this era, and whose role has been deliberately obscured by the cartographic service, listened to her report in silence for 2 hours. Then he asked her one question. Did the humans know that she knew? Mara Tellon said she did not believe so. Her supervisor nodded once, took her files, and instructed her to return to her normal duties. He told her she had done well. He told her the matter would now be handled at a higher level. What he did not tell her was that the higher level had already been handling the matter for several years. The Concord's senior cartographic leadership had become aware of human presence in the borderlands at least 3 years before Mara Tellon's discovery, through a different incident involving a different probe. They had chosen, for reasons that have been debated by every Concord historian who has had access to the relevant files, not to act on that knowledge. They had chosen to watch the watchers. By the time Probe 742 returned, the Concord and humanity had been watching each other in silence for several years, each side convinced that the other did not know it was being observed, each side wrong. The breakthrough came in 2197, 8 years after Mara Tellon's discovery, and it came not because either side decided to speak first, but because a single human captain decided that the silence had gone on long enough. His name was Joran Cade. Joran Cade was, by the standards of his own civilization, not a particularly important person. He commanded a single unarmed survey vessel called the Marin Holt, named for his mother. He had spent 14 years operating in the borderlands of Concord space, doing the same patient observation work that hundreds of other human captains were doing in those years. He had never fired a weapon in anger. He had never, in fact, fired a weapon at all. What Joran Cade did in 2197 was something that the Concord's contact protocols were entirely unprepared for. He flew the Marin Holt directly into Concord space, took up a stable orbit around a minor cartographic station in the border region, and waited. He did not broadcast. He did not announce. He did not transmit any of the standard signals that the Concord's protocols recognized as a request for contact. He simply held position in orbit and waited to be noticed. The cartographic station noticed within 40 minutes. The station's commander, a Visal officer whose response to the situation has been studied in Concord diplomatic academies ever since, did not raise an alarm. He did not signal the regional fleet. He did not initiate the suppression protocols that his standing orders required him to initiate in the event of an unidentified vessel in Concord space. What he did was open a single narrowband communications channel and ask, in the trade dialect that humans had been using for years in the borderlands, whether the vessel required assistance. Joran Cade replied that he did not require assistance. He explained that he was a representative of his civilization, that his civilization had been aware of the Concord for some time, and that his civilization had decided that the time for quiet observation had ended. He asked for an introduction to the Concord's diplomatic apparatus. He did not ask for treaty. He did not ask for trade rights. He did not ask for territory or recognition or any of the things that formal first contact ceremonies traditionally produced. He asked simply for an introduction. The negotiation that followed lasted 11 years. The figure who shaped the negotiation more than any other was a human linguist named Ian Lebrun. Ian Lebrun had been part of the quiet human network in the borderlands for 19 years by the time Joran Cade made first formal contact. She had spent 11 of those years doing nothing but listening to Concord broadcasts and learning the patterns of how the Concord's many species spoke to each other. When the formal negotiations began, Ian Lebrun did something that no Concord linguist had ever seen any other species do in a first contact situation. She refused to use her own language. She refused to ask the Concord to learn human speech. She conducted the entire 11-year negotiation in Concord trade dialect, with the fluency and precision of a native speaker, because she had decided that the side that adapted first would shape the conversation. The Concord's diplomats arrived at every session expecting to extend a generous gesture of accommodation. They found themselves instead negotiating with a human who already understood their language better than most of their own junior staff. The asymmetry was so complete and so unexpected that the Concord's negotiating team requested 3 separate replacements in the first 2 years. Each new team convinced that the previous team had simply been outmaneuvered, each new team discovering within weeks that the same thing was happening to them. What Ian Lebrun was doing, and what the Concord's diplomats did not understand until much later, was that she was not trying to win the negotiation. She was trying to demonstrate something. She was demonstrating that humans had been listening for so long and so carefully that the Concord could no longer pretend the relationship was beginning. The relationship had already existed for 2 decades. The only thing being negotiated was whether the Concord was willing to acknowledge it. By 2208, the Concord acknowledged it. The treaties that followed were unprecedented in Concord diplomatic history, not because of their terms, but because of what they did not contain. They contained no transition period. They contained no provisions for human observers to integrate into Concord space, because human observers were already integrated. They contained no schedule for the establishment of trade routes, because the trade routes already existed. The treaties simply formalized what had already happened in the dark. The peak of the era was not a moment of triumph or ceremony. It was a moment of recognition. The Concord recognized, formally and in writing, that it had been observed and outweighed by a species that had used patience as its primary diplomatic weapon and had used silence as its primary intelligence-gathering tool. The species that listens longest, the Concord's chief negotiator wrote in the private journal that was published after his death, is the species that shapes the conversation. The Concord, having shaped every previous first contact in its 4,000-year history, found itself for the first time on the other side of the table. The political response within the Concord was not unified. A faction of senior Concord officials, particularly within the regional fleets that had been embarrassed by the discovery of how thoroughly the borderlands had been penetrated, demanded that the Concord assert its sovereignty in the human-influenced territories before the situation became permanent. The faction was led by an admiral named Velrith of the 7th Spire, a decorated officer whose career had been built on the suppression of pirate activity in the outer territories, and whose understanding of how to handle unrecognized presences in conquered space had been formed in an era when those presences could be defeated by superior force. Velrith was given a fleet and a mandate. His instructions were ambiguous in the way that politically sensitive instructions often are. He was told to manage the human presence. He was not told what management meant. He was given the authority to use whatever measures he considered appropriate, and the implicit understanding that the Concord's senior leadership would prefer not to know the specifics. What Velrith did in 2213 was the only military incident of the entire era. He moved against a small human settlement on a border world called Tessin Reach, a settlement that had grown up around a human-operated trading post and that had no military significance whatsoever. His stated justification was that the settlement was operating outside Concord legal jurisdiction and required formal incorporation. His actual reason, as his own later writings made clear, was that he believed a demonstration of Concord resolve was needed to remind the humans that they were guests in Concord space, and that the terms of their presence were ultimately set by the Concord. The settlement at Tessin Reach contained 412 humans. It had no weapons heavier than personal sidearms. It had no defensive infrastructure. Velrith arrived with 3 Concord cruisers and a full Marine complement, expecting to occupy the settlement, detain its leadership, and present the Concord's diplomatic apparatus with a fait accompli that would force a renegotiation of the human treaties on more favorable terms. What happened at Tessin Reach has been classified by the Concord for the entire intervening century. The official records refer to it only as the Tessin Reach incident. The unofficial accounts, which have leaked into Concord historical scholarship over the decades, describe something that has no parallel in Concord military history. The humans had been expecting him. They had been expecting someone like him for at least 4 years. Their preparation had not taken the form of military buildup, because they had no intention of fighting a conquered fleet. Their preparation had taken the form of information gathering, of relationship building with the Vale families on the surrounding border worlds, of the kind of quiet diplomatic groundwork that the Concord's intelligence services had never thought to monitor. When Velrith's fleet arrived in orbit, every Vale border world within 12 light-years simultaneously cut its trade contracts with the Concord's central authority and announced that it would not provide resupply or staging support for the operation. The fleet was not attacked. It was not threatened. It was simply isolated. Velrith found himself in possession of a military force that could destroy the Tessin Reach settlement easily, and an inability to do anything else. He could not advance further into human-influenced space without resupply. He could not return to conquered space without explaining how he had managed to alienate 14 Vale border worlds in the course of a single operation. He could not occupy the settlement without triggering a diplomatic crisis that would consume his career. He withdrew. The withdrawal was the most quiet military defeat in conquered history because it involved no combat, no casualties, and no formal acknowledgement of defeat from either side. But every senior officer in the conquered fleet understood what had happened. Velrith had attempted to apply force to a situation in which force was not the operative variable. He had assumed that the humans would respond to military pressure by negotiating. He had not understood that the humans had already negotiated, years earlier, with everyone except him. Velrith was recalled, formally censured, and assigned to a desk position in a remote sector where he spent the remainder of his career writing reports nobody read. His warning to the Concord, contained in a long letter he submitted to the Central Command in the months after his recall, has been studied by every generation of conquered diplomats since. The humans, Velrith wrote, were not what they seemed. They were not weak. They were not peaceful in any sense the conquered understood peace. They had simply chosen patience as their primary weapon, and patience was a weapon the conquered had no defense against, because the conquered had never imagined that any species would be willing to wait as long as humans were willing to wait. His warning was filed. It was not acted on. By the time the conquered understood that he had been right, the transformation was already complete. The transformation began with a trader named Devon Marsh. Devon Marsh arrived on the Vale border world of Halen Crossing in 2217, 4 years after the Tesson Reach incident, with a small ship, a moderate amount of capital, and no diplomatic credentials of any kind. He was not part of the formal human delegation. He was not connected to Joran Cade or Ea Brun. He was, by the new terms that the human civilization had begun using to describe its own representatives, a private citizen. What Devon Marsh did on Halen Crossing has no parallel in any previous first contact era in conquered history. He did not establish a trading post. He did not build a settlement. He did not request territory or commercial rights or any of the structures that previous human commercial figures had built in the borderlands. He married into a Vale family. The family in question was the Tellin lineage, an old archivist clan whose senior members had been quietly aware of the human presence in the borderlands for nearly 30 years, and whose junior members had grown up assuming that humans were a normal feature of border world life. The marriage was not arranged through diplomatic channels. It was not approved by any conquered authority. It happened the way marriages happen on border worlds, between two people who had been working together on a small commercial venture, and who had decided, after some years, that they preferred to continue working together formally. The marriage was the first of its kind. It was not the last. Within 10 years, mixed conquered human households had become a recognizable feature of border world society, concentrated in the regions where human presence had been longest established, but spreading inward toward the conquered core worlds with each passing year. The children of those households grew up speaking both languages from birth, holding citizenship in both civilizations, and operating in social and commercial spaces that neither civilization had designed and neither civilization could fully regulate. The most remarkable figure to emerge from this transformation was Hanan Reyes. Hanan Reyes was the child of one of Devon Marsh's daughters and a Vale administrator named Senenkel. She was born in 2222, raised in a household where both languages were spoken at every meal, and educated at institutions in both civilizations. By the time she reached adulthood in the early 2240s, she occupied a position in conquered human relations that no previous figure had occupied. She was not a diplomat from one civilization to the other. She was a citizen of both, and her authority derived from the fact that the legal frameworks of both civilizations recognized her as their own. She used that dual authority strategically. She negotiated trade frameworks that no purely human diplomat could have negotiated, and no purely Vale administrator could have approved. She built institutions, in the territories where mixed households had become common, that operated under both legal systems simultaneously, and that produced commercial and cultural outcomes that neither civilization, operating alone, could have produced. What Hanan Reyes built, and what her generation of mixed heritage administrators built around her, was not a new civilization. It was something stranger and harder to categorize. It was a permanent space of overlap between two civilizations that had not previously known how to overlap with each other. The legal framework she negotiated remained in place for more than a century. The institutions she founded still operate today. The descendants of her generation are now among the most senior figures in the conquered's diplomatic apparatus, and they are also, in the human civilization's own accounting, among the most respected figures in human cultural and commercial life. The sea story had become a land story. The era of quiet observation had become an era of permanent integration. And the conquered, which had once believed that it controlled its own borders, had become a civilization that no longer knew exactly where its borders ended or where the human civilization began. The legend of Quiet Harbor emerged from this period, and it has been the subject of more controversy in conquered historical scholarship than almost any other element of the era. The legend appears in a single document, a long manuscript written by a Vale archivist named Sen of the Pale Library, whose real identity has been debated by conquered historians for nearly a century. Some scholars believe Sen of the Pale Library was a pseudonym for a senior Vale administrator who could not afford to publish under their real name. Others believe Sen was a composite, a fictional voice constructed by a group of Vale archivists to publish materials that would have been suppressed if attributed to any individual. The manuscript described a settlement called Quiet Harbor, located somewhere in the deep interior of conquered space, where humans and Vale lived together in a community that operated outside the formal laws of both civilizations. In Quiet Harbor, Sen wrote, the hierarchies of Vale society had been abandoned. Archivists who had defected from the conquered's official institutions lived alongside human traders and settlers in a community organized around mutual aid and shared knowledge. There were no titles. There was no formal authority. Disputes were resolved through council meetings open to every adult resident. Children were educated in both cultural traditions from birth, and the curriculum was determined by the community rather than by either civilization's educational ministries. It was, in Sen's telling, not merely a hidden settlement but a deliberate alternative to the way both civilizations had organized themselves. Most modern conquered historians believe that Quiet Harbor, as described by Sen of the Pale Library, was either entirely fictional or a heavily romanticized composite of real mixed settlements. The specific details in the manuscript, the names of the founders, the dates of major events, the geographical location, do not match any verified historical record. Some scholars have suggested that Sen invented the whole thing as a vehicle for political commentary, using the legend of an egalitarian hybrid community as a way to critique the hierarchies of Vale society in a form that was publishable without being directly seditious. Whether or not that interpretation is correct, what is certain is that the Quiet Harbor legend did not emerge from nothing. It emerged from the reality of the mixed border settlements, from the genuine existence of communities where Vale and human inhabitants had developed ways of living together that neither civilization had designed, and neither civilization could fully describe. The legend captured something true about those communities, even if the specific details were invented. It captured the perception, widespread among the Vale who lived in those communities, that something genuinely new had emerged in the borderlands. Something that was not a conquered institution and was not a human institution, but was a third thing that had grown up between the two. The real border settlements were not utopias. They were complicated, hierarchical in their own ways, full of internal conflicts and unresolved tensions. But they were different from anything either civilization had produced before, and contemporaries noticed. The Quiet Harbor legend, however imperfectly, was their attempt to describe what they had noticed. The end of the Quiet Era came gradually, through a combination of factors that were political and economic rather than primarily military. By 2228, the volume of trade between the human and Vale civilizations had grown to a scale that could no longer be managed by the informal networks that had sustained it through the early decades. The mixed households of the border worlds had produced a generation of administrators who could not function within either civilization's traditional legal frameworks, and the pressure for formal institutional reform had become irresistible. The conquered changed its contact laws. The human civilization, which had operated without a formal, centralized government for most of the Quiet Era, established its first permanent diplomatic mission within conquered space. Trade routes were formalized. The shadow economy of the borderlands became legitimate commerce. By 2231, the era was over. The outer quiet was no longer quiet. The men and women who had operated in the silences of the early years were old or retired, or had moved into the formal institutions that had grown up around their earlier work. The infrastructure of the quiet era, the small trading posts, the unofficial listening stations, the discreet networks of border-world merchants who had known about humans for years before the conquered did, was decayed or absorbed into the new official structures. The era ended because it was absorbed, not because it was defeated. There was no decisive moment, no formal ceremony marking the transition, no event that could be pointed to as the end. There was simply a gradual thickening of formality, a slow accumulation of treaties and protocols and recognized institutions, until one day the conquered's administrators looked at the borderlands and realized that what had once been a region of quiet observation was now a fully integrated part of two civilizations that had become permanently entangled with each other. The legacy did not disappear. The conquered's contact laws were rewritten to account for the possibility of species that did not broadcast, species that observed before announcing themselves, species that used patience as a primary diplomatic instrument. The new protocols, drafted in the 2230s and refined in the decades that followed, are still the framework under which the conquered conducts every first contact today. The diplomatic academies teach Ile Brun's negotiation methods as standard curriculum. The military academies teach the Tesson Reach incident as the definitive example of how superior force fails against patient diplomacy. The mixed households that grew up in the borderlands have produced, over the past century, more senior conquered administrators per capita than any other demographic group in conquered space. And the original probe, Probe 742, the small unmanned vehicle that returned in 2189, carrying a reflection in its sensor housing that no one was supposed to see, still exists. It is preserved in a museum on the conquered capital. It sits in a sealed glass case in a quiet exhibition hall that most visitors walk past without stopping. The probe itself is unremarkable to look at, a small cylindrical machine scarred by its long journey, slightly tarnished, smaller than most visitors expect. The placard beside it describes it in clinical language. The placard does not mention Mara Tellon. The placard does not mention the reflection. The placard does not explain what the probe was, or what it found, or why it matters. The museum's senior archivist, a Vale woman now in the late stages of her career, stands in that hall some afternoons and watches the visitors pass through. She sees conquered children and human children moving together through the exhibition, hand in hand, speaking the mixed dialect that the border-world households have made standard. They do not stop at the probe. They have no reason to. The story of why they share a sky has been folded so thoroughly into the ordinary structure of their lives that the artifact at the center of it has become invisible. She watches them anyway. She watches the way they speak to each other. She watches the way they assume, without thinking about it, that the other species is simply a normal part of the world. She thinks about Mara Tellon, who saw a reflection in a window that should not have existed and chose to be quiet about it. She thinks about Joran Cade, who flew into conquered space alone and waited to be noticed. She thinks about Ile Brun, who listened for 11 years before she spoke. She thinks about Devon Marsh and Hanan Reyes and the long, patient generation of border-world administrators who built a civilization in the spaces between two other civilizations, and who did it so quietly that most of the conquered never noticed it was happening. They watched first. That was the lesson. That was the thing the conquered had not understood and had not been able to understand, until the species that understood it arrived in the conquered's own space and demonstrated it patiently for 40 years. The galaxy had assumed that intelligence announced itself. The galaxy had assumed that civilization was loud. The galaxy had assumed that the species worth meeting were the species that came forward to be met. The humans had proved otherwise. They had proved that the species who listens longest is the species that shapes the conversation. They had proved that intelligence is not what announces itself. Intelligence is what waits. The museum closes at sunset. The archivist locks the exhibition hall and walks out into the conquered capital's evening light, past the statues of founders and the monuments to formal first contact, and the great hall of the spire where the official ceremonies are still held for new species joining the conquered. She walks past all of it, the visible history, the version of events that the textbooks teach. She thinks about the version that the textbooks do not teach. The 40 quiet years, the reflection in the window, the single afternoon when a junior technician chose to look before she spoke. The probe sits in its case, behind her in the dark. If this history gave you a different picture of what first contact actually is and how it actually happens, you know what to do. Subscribe and stay close. There are other forgotten chapters in the long story of how the galaxy learned what humans are, and we will be telling them, one quiet era at a time. Leave a comment with which chapter you want next. The stories that got left out of the official archives are always the ones worth telling.